At 2:37 on a Tuesday afternoon that had begun with spring sunshine and royal optimism, a convoy of unmarked medical vehicles pulled through the private gates of Windsor Castle. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the kind of silent urgency that announces catastrophe more effectively than any alarm ever could. Inside the castle's medical suite, a team of specialists had assembled with a speed that suggested they'd been on standby, waiting for a call they'd hoped would never come. And in a corridor lined with portraits of monarchs who had faced their own impossible moments, Prince William stood frozen, his phone still clutched in his hand, staring at a message that had arrived 60 seconds earlier. "You need to come now. It's Catherine." The emergency William had been 20 minutes into a Veterans Housing Initiative visit in South London when his protection officer approached with an expression that made his stomach drop before a single word was spoken. The officer leaned in close, his voice barely audible above the polite conversations happening around them. "Sir, we need to leave immediately. It's urgent." The word urgent carried a particular weight in royal security protocol. It wasn't used for inconveniences or scheduling conflicts. It was reserved for genuine emergencies, for moments when normal procedures had to be abandoned in favor of speed and discretion. William excused himself with practiced grace, offering apologies to the charity organizers who had spent weeks preparing for this visit. He smiled, shook hands, and moved toward the exit as if nothing was wrong, because that's what years of training demanded. But the moment he reached the car, the mask fell away. "What's happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with fear he could no longer disguise. His protection officer's response was careful, measured, clearly following instructions to share only what was absolutely necessary. "The Princess of Wales has been taken to the private medical suite at Windsor. The medical team has been assembled. That's all I've been told, sir." But the way he said it, the tension in his shoulders, the speed at which the car was already moving, told William everything the words didn't. This wasn't a precaution. This was a crisis. The drive to Windsor should have taken 40 minutes. They made it in 23, using routes and speeds normally reserved for genuine security threats. William sat in the back seat, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Catherine had seemed fine that morning, tired perhaps, but she'd been tired for weeks. They'd both attributed it to the relentless schedule, the constant demands, the weight of being the most photographed woman in the world while trying to raise 3 children and support a monarchy in transition. When they arrived at Windsor, the scene confirmed his worst fears. The medical suite, normally staffed by a single physician and a nurse, was now crowded with specialists William recognized from the most serious royal health crises: Dr. Sarah Chen, the oncologist who had treated his father; Professor Michael Hartley, a neurologist whose presence suggested complications far beyond routine illness; and standing near the entrance, looking older than William had ever seen him, was Sir Clive Alderton, whose grim expression spoke volumes before he uttered a single word. "Where is she?" William asked, already moving toward the suite's private rooms. "With the medical team," Sir Clive replied, stepping into William's path. "Your Royal Highness, before you go in, the doctors need to brief you. There are complications, serious complications." William felt the floor shift beneath him. Complications from what? She was fine this morning. She had breakfast with the children. She was laughing about something Louis said. His voice was rising, desperation bleeding through the composure he'd maintained during the drive. What happened? Sir Clive's face carried the weight of someone delivering news he'd give anything not to have to share. She collapsed during a private meeting. Loss of consciousness, neurological symptoms. The team has been running tests for the past 90 minutes. He paused, choosing his next words with excruciating care. "William, it's serious, more serious than any of us realized." Before William could respond, the door to the medical suite opened and Dr. Chen emerged, her face professionally composed, but her eyes revealing something that made William's blood run cold. She wasn't coming to deliver good news. She was coming to prepare him for devastation. The deterioration. To understand how a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon collapsed into medical emergency, we must look back at the weeks preceding this moment. Weeks that now, in retrospect, carried warning signs everyone had been too busy or too hopeful to recognize. Catherine's exhaustion hadn't begun that morning, or even that week. It had been building gradually since late winter, a creeping fatigue that she'd dismissed as the natural consequence of royal life's demands. It started small, headaches that lingered longer than they should, moments of dizziness she'd hidden from everyone except her closest lady in waiting, a persistent nausea that made morning engagements increasingly difficult, though she'd powered through with the same grace and composure the public had come to expect. She'd mentioned it to William, of course, but in the casual way people discuss minor annoyances, not genuine concerns. "I think I need to adjust my schedule," she'd said one evening. "Everything feels harder lately." William, consumed with his own responsibilities and his father's ongoing health challenges, had encouraged her to see the royal physician. She'd gone dutifully and received reassurances that felt adequate at the time. Stress, overwork, perhaps a vitamin deficiency. The doctor had ordered blood tests, prescribed supplements, and suggested reducing her workload. Catherine had nodded, agreed to all of it, and then continued at the same relentless pace, because that's what being Princess of Wales demanded. You didn't slow down simply because you felt tired. You slowed down when you physically couldn't continue, and even then, you did it discreetly. But by early spring, the symptoms had intensified in ways that could no longer be dismissed as stress or fatigue. Catherine began experiencing moments of confusion, brief episodes where she'd lose her train of thought mid-sentence. She'd be discussing school arrangements with the children's tutors and suddenly forget what she'd been saying, her mind going blank in ways that frightened her more than she admitted to anyone. She'd be walking through Kensington Palace and feel the world tilt slightly, as if gravity had shifted direction for just a moment before righting itself. The most alarming incident had occurred a week earlier, though only her private secretary and a single lady-in-waiting knew about it. Catherine had been preparing for a morning engagement, getting dressed in her private rooms, when she suddenly couldn't remember how to fasten her necklace. Not that she'd forgotten which necklace to wear, but the actual mechanics of the clasp, something she'd done thousands of times, became momentarily incomprehensible. Her hands had moved to the back of her neck and simply stopped, confused, as if the neural pathways required for this basic task had temporarily disconnected. She'd recovered within seconds, the knowledge flooding back as mysteriously as it had disappeared, but the episode had terrified her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She'd mentioned it to William that evening, making it sound less frightening than it felt, framing it as exhaustion rather than something more sinister. William had insisted she see the doctor again, and she'd promised she would, after the upcoming engagements, after the children's school events, after the schedule cleared slightly. There was always an after, always a reason to postpone the appointment that might reveal something she wasn't ready to face. The medical team, when they'd finally conducted more comprehensive tests 2 days before the collapse, had found anomalies that prompted immediate concern. Dr. Chen, brought in for a specialist consultation, had reviewed the imaging results with an expression that shifted from professional interest to barely concealed alarm. She'd ordered additional scans, more specific tests, telling Catherine with careful optimism that they were simply being thorough, ruling out unlikely possibilities. But Catherine, who had learned to read the subtle cues people gave when they were hiding fear, understood that the doctor had seen something that worried her deeply. On the morning of the collapse, Catherine had woken feeling strangely detached, as if she were watching herself move through the day from a slight distance. She'd had breakfast with the family, participated in conversations, smiled at Lewis's jokes about his teacher, but some part of her awareness felt muffled, like listening to the world through cotton wool. She'd attributed it to poor sleep, to the anxiety that had been building as she waited for test results, to the general weight of everything she'd been carrying. The meeting where she collapsed had been routine, a discussion with her communications team about upcoming charitable initiatives. She'd been mid-sentence, talking about early childhood development programs, when the words simply stopped coming. Not because she'd lost her train of thought, but because her mouth wouldn't form the sounds her brain was trying to produce. She'd felt a strange, tingling sensation spreading down her left side, followed by a darkness that rose up like a wave, and then nothing. Just the sensation of falling and the distant sound of voices calling her name with rising panic. When she'd regained consciousness, perhaps 30 seconds later, she'd been on the floor with her private secretary kneeling beside her, speaking urgently into a phone. The medical team had arrived within minutes, already mobilized, already prepared for something they'd apparently been expecting. And as Catherine was helped into a wheelchair, as she was transported to the medical suite she'd visited so casually for routine checkups, she'd understood with sudden crystal clarity that whatever had been growing inside her, whatever had been stealing pieces of her function week by week, had finally announced itself in a way that could no longer be ignored or postponed or explained away. Behind the diagnosis, Dr. Chen led William into a small consultation room adjacent to the medical suite, a space designed for exactly this purpose, delivering news too serious for corridor conversations. Professor Hartley was already there, along with 2 other specialists William didn't recognize, but whose presence suggested the situation required expertise beyond the palace's usual medical resources. Through the wall, William could hear the quiet beeping of monitoring equipment, the low murmur of medical staff, and beneath it all, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken catastrophe. "Where is Catherine?" William asked before anyone could begin their prepared briefing. "I need to see her." "She's resting," Dr. Chen replied gently. "The episode exhausted her, and we've given her something to help her sleep while we complete the final tests. But Your Royal Highness, before you see her, we need to discuss what we've found." She gestured to a chair, but William remained standing, his body rigid with tension that wouldn't allow him to sit, to relax, to do anything that suggested accepting whatever was coming. Dr. Chen exchanged glances with Professor Hartley, a silent communication that decided who would deliver the blow. She pulled up images on a tablet, medical scans that meant nothing to William's untrained eye but everything to the specialists in the room. "The Princess of Wales has a significant neurological complication," she began, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed these words, who understood their weight. "The imaging shows a mass in the frontal lobe of her brain, approximately 3 centimeters in diameter, with characteristics that are deeply concerning." William heard the words, but couldn't process them, couldn't connect them to Catherine, to his wife who had been laughing at breakfast, who had kissed the children goodbye that morning. "A mass," he repeated slowly. "You mean a tumor?" "Yes," Professor Hartley confirmed, "a tumor. And based on its location, its growth pattern, and the symptoms the princess has been experiencing, we have significant concerns about its nature and progression." The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. William gripped the back of the chair he'd refused to sit in, needing something solid to anchor him as the world tilted. "What kind of tumor? Is it—" He couldn't finish the question, couldn't say the word that hung in the air between them like poison. Dr. Chen's expression answered before her words did. "We need to conduct a biopsy to confirm, but the imaging characteristics are consistent with an aggressive form. The location is particularly challenging because it's affecting areas responsible for motor control, speech, and cognitive function, which explains the symptoms she's been experiencing." She paused, letting that information settle before delivering the rest. "William, this is serious. This is as serious as it gets." William felt his legs weaken, felt the floor becoming unreliable beneath him. He finally sat, not from choice, but from necessity, his body making the decision his mind couldn't. "How long has this been growing?" he asked, his voice sounding distant and strange. "Based on the size and the progression of symptoms, likely several months, possibly longer." Professor Hartley leaned forward, his tone shifting from clinical to compassionate. "Your Royal Highness, I know this is devastating news, but we need to move quickly. The tumor's location means it's continuing to affect critical brain function. The collapse today was a warning sign. There will be more episodes, potentially more severe, if we don't intervene immediately." "Intervene how?" William asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Surgery," Dr. Chen replied. "We need to remove as much of the tumor as possible. The operation is complex, high risk given the location, but it's necessary. Without intervention, the symptoms will worsen rapidly." She met his eyes directly, refusing to soften what came next. "William, without treatment, we're looking at weeks to months. With treatment, we can extend that time frame significantly, potentially years, but there are no guarantees." The words "weeks to months" echoed in William's mind, impossible to fully comprehend. He thought of George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would come home from school expecting their mother to be there. He thought of Catherine herself, who had poured everything into being the perfect princess, the perfect mother, the perfect example of grace under pressure. He thought of all the plans they'd made, the future they'd envisioned, the reign they were supposed to share for decades to come. "Can I see her now?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. Dr. Chen nodded. "Of course, but William, she doesn't know yet. We wanted to brief you first. The conversation about her diagnosis needs to happen carefully, with both of you present, with time to process and ask questions." William stood slowly, his movements mechanical. "She's going to ask me what's wrong the moment I walk in. I can't lie to her, I won't. Then we'll tell her together," Dr. Chen said softly. "Right now." They walked through the corridor to Catherine's room, and with each step, William felt the weight of what he was about to witness. The moment his wife learned that her life, their life, everything they'd built together, was about to be torn apart by something invisible, something neither of them could control or fight with anything resembling fairness. When Dr. Chen opened the door, Catherine was sitting up in bed, pale but awake, her eyes finding William's immediately with a question that broke his heart before she even spoke it aloud. "William, what's happening? Why won't anyone tell me what's wrong?" A marriage under siege. The moment William entered Catherine's room and their eyes met, something between them shifted in a way that would never fully shift back. She knew. Not the specifics, not the medical terminology, not the time frames or treatment options, but she knew from his expression, from the way Dr. Chen and Professor Hartley filed in behind him, with faces carefully arranged into professional compassion, that whatever had been slowly stealing pieces of her over the past months had finally revealed itself as something catastrophic. "Sit down," Catherine said, her voice steady but thin, gesturing to the chair beside her bed. Her hand trembled slightly as she moved it, a detail William noticed and filed away alongside all the other small signs he'd missed or dismissed over recent weeks. She lost weight, grew pale, but attributed it to the demands of her schedule, rather than the emotional toll of constant psychological warfare. When Catherine was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024, it felt in some ways like her body manifesting the stress she had carried for so long. "Just tell me. Whatever it is, just tell me." William sat, taking her hand in both of his, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the warmth of the room. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her tablet in hand, prepared to deliver the diagnosis with clinical precision. But William spoke first, unable to let anyone else carry this burden, unable to hide behind medical professionals when his wife needed to hear truth from him. "They found something, Catherine. A tumor. In your brain." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Catherine didn't cry, didn't gasp, didn't react in any of the dramatic ways people imagine they might respond to such news. Instead, she simply nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected, something she'd been waiting to have named. "That explains it then," she said quietly. "The headaches, the confusion, the feeling like I was disappearing piece by piece." She looked at Dr. Chen. "How bad?" Dr. Chen moved closer, pulling up the imaging on her tablet, showing Catherine the scan that William had seen minutes earlier but still couldn't fully comprehend. "It's significant," she said carefully. "Located in the frontal lobe, which explains the symptoms you've been experiencing. The good news, if we can call it that, is that it's operable. We can intervene surgically." "And the bad news?" Catherine asked, her journalist's instinct for finding the truth beneath careful phrasing still intact despite everything. Professor Hartley took over, his decades of experience showing in the way he delivered information that was neither falsely hopeful nor unnecessarily cruel. "The location makes surgery complex and risky. There's potential for complications affecting motor function, speech, cognitive abilities, and based on the imaging characteristics, we're concerned about the tumor's aggressiveness. Even with successful surgery, we'll need to follow up with aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, possibly radiation." Catherine absorbed this information with a composure that made William's heart ache. She had always been strong, had always faced challenges with grace, but this was different. This was her own body betraying her own brain turning against itself. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "How long do I have to make decisions?" "Days, not weeks," Dr. Chen replied. "The collapse today indicates the tumor is beginning to affect critical function more severely. We need to operate as soon as possible, ideally within the next 72 hours. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of that time frame settling over everyone present. 72 hours to prepare for brain surgery. 72 hours to explain to 3 young children why their mother would be in hospital. 72 hours to prepare the nation for news that would shake the monarchy to its foundations." Catherine turned to William, and in her eyes he saw not fear, not quite, but something more complex, a mixture of grief for the future they'd planned, determination to fight for the life they still had, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "The children," she said simply. "How do we tell them?" William felt something crack inside him, a fissure that had been forming since the moment he'd received the emergency call. Throughout the medical briefing, throughout the impossible statistics and grim prognoses, he'd maintained some semblance of composure. But the thought of telling George, Charlotte, and Louis that their mother was seriously ill, that she might not get better, that their world was about to change in ways they couldn't possibly understand, broke something fundamental in him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "I don't know how to tell them something I can barely comprehend myself." Catherine squeezed his hand, and in that moment, their roles reversed. She became the comforter, the steady presence, the one offering strength even as her own body failed her. "We tell them the truth," she said. "Age-appropriate truth, but truth. They deserve that. They deserve to understand why Mummy might be different for a while, why I might not be able to do all the things I usually do." Dr. Chen interjected gently. "There are specialists who work with families, who can help guide that conversation. You don't have to navigate this alone." But William knew that ultimately, the burden would fall on him and Catherine, sitting with their children in some quiet room, watching their innocence shatter as they learned that bad things could happen even to people they loved, even to people who seemed invincible. George, at 11, would understand too much. Charlotte, sensitive and perceptive, would internalize the fear and carry it like a weight. And Louis, still so young, would sense the shift in atmosphere, the tension in adult voices, without fully grasping why his world had suddenly become frightening. What happens if... William couldn't finish the question, couldn't voice the possibility that haunted him most. What happens if the surgery doesn't work? What happens if the tumor is worse than they think? What happens if I lose her? Catherine answered the question he couldn't complete. "If the worst happens, you keep going. You protect the children. You do the job we've been preparing for." Her voice wavered slightly. "You don't let this destroy what we've built." William shook his head, tears finally breaking through the composure he'd maintained. "I can't do this without you. The children can't lose you. I can't lose you." The words came out broken, desperate, stripped of any royal dignity or practiced poise. He was simply a husband, facing the possibility of losing his wife, a father imagining having to raise 3 children alone, a man confronting a future he'd never allowed himself to consider. Catherine pulled him closer, ignoring the monitoring equipment, the medical staff discreetly moving toward the door to give them privacy. "You can," she said firmly, "because you have to. Because that's what we do. We show up even when it's impossible." She pressed her forehead against his. "But I'm not gone yet. I'm still here, and I'm going to fight this with everything I have." Professor Hartley cleared his throat gently. "I'll give you time alone," he said. "But we need to begin coordinating the surgery soon. There are preparations to make, specialists to consult, protocols to establish." As the medical team filed out, Leaving William and Catherine in the fragile privacy of the hospital room, the full weight of their situation settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't a problem they could solve with duty or determination. This wasn't a crisis they could manage with careful public relations. This was life, raw and brutal and utterly indifferent to crowns or titles, or the carefully constructed plans of people who thought they had time. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun continued shining, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding inside. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, people went about their ordinary days, unaware that the Princess of Wales was fighting for her life, unaware that the monarchy they followed was about to face one of its darkest chapters. And in that hospital room, William held Catherine's hand and tried to memorize the feeling, terrified it might be among the last normal moments they would ever share. The impossible choice. The following morning brought not clarity but complexity of a kind William had never imagined having to navigate. He'd spent the night in a chair beside Catherine's bed, dozing fitfully while medical staff came and went, checking monitors, adjusting medications, maintaining the quiet vigil that serious illness demands. Catherine had slept heavily, the sedatives keeping her in a darkness that was mercy compared to the brutal reality waiting when she woke. And when dawn finally broke through the windows, painting the medical suite in shades of gray and gold, a new team of specialists arrived with information that would make an already impossible situation even more unbearable. Dr. Chen entered first, followed by Professor Hartley and two additional doctors William hadn't met before. A neurosurgeon named Dr. James Morrison, whose reputation preceded him, and an oncologist named Dr. Priya Kapoor, whose presence suggested the medical team was preparing for every possibility, including the ones too terrible to name aloud. They arranged themselves around the room with the practiced choreography of people who had delivered devastating news before, who understood that positioning and tone could make the difference between information that could be absorbed and information that simply overwhelmed. "Your Royal Highness, Princess Catherine," Dr. Morrison began, his Scottish accent lending a gentle quality to words that were anything but gentle. "We've completed additional imaging overnight and consulted with specialists across Europe and the United States. We need to discuss surgical options and their implications." Catherine was awake now, sitting up in bed with a composure that William found simultaneously admirable and heartbreaking. She'd insisted on being fully alert for this conversation, refusing additional sedatives despite the doctor's suggestions. "Tell us everything," she said. "Don't soften it. We need to understand exactly what we're facing." Dr. Morrison pulled up imaging on the large screen that had been wheeled into the room, showing cross-sections of Catherine's brain in luminous detail. The tumor was visible even to William's untrained eye, an irregular mass that seemed to glow against the surrounding tissue. "The tumor is located in a region that controls several critical functions," he explained, using a stylus to highlight specific areas. "Motor control for your left side, speech processing, and what we call executive function, your ability to plan, organize, make decisions." "We knew that already," William said, perhaps more sharply than he intended. "What are the options?" Dr. Morrison met his eyes with a directness that William appreciated, even as he dreaded what would come next. "We have two surgical approaches, each with different risk profiles and potential outcomes. The first option is aggressive resection, attempting to remove as much of the tumor as possible. This gives us the best chance of extending life expectancy significantly, potentially years. But the risks are substantial. The surgery could result in permanent deficits, paralysis on the left side, speech difficulties, cognitive impairment. There's approximately a 30% chance of severe complications that would dramatically affect quality of life." Catherine's hand found William's, squeezing tightly. "And the second option? Conservative resection," Dr. Kapoor answered. "We remove only the portions of the tumor that are immediately life-threatening, leaving the areas too integrated with critical function. This approach has much lower risk of surgical complications, preserving most of your current abilities. But it's not curative. The remaining tumor will continue to grow, and the timeline becomes much shorter. We'd be looking at months rather than years. The choice they were presenting was impossible, grotesque in its cruelty. Risk everything for more time that might be spent unable to speak, move, or recognize her own children, or preserve who she was now, knowing that very self would disappear slowly as the tumor consumed more of her brain. William wanted to rage at them, to demand a third option, a miracle solution that didn't exist. But he knew they were simply presenting reality, however unbearable that reality might be. "How much time?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the question's weight. With the conservative approach, "How long?" Professor Hartley, who had remained quiet until now, spoke with the careful honesty of someone who understood that false hope was crueler than harsh truth. 6 to 9 months, possibly longer with aggressive chemotherapy and radiation. But the decline would be progressive. You'd lose function gradually, first the motor control, then speech, then cognitive abilities. The final months would likely require full-time care. "And with the aggressive surgery?" William asked. "If it's successful, if there are no complications, what's the timeline then?" "Potentially years," Dr. Morrison replied. "With follow-up treatment, we've seen patients live 5, even 10 years with good quality of life. But that's the best-case scenario. The 30% complication rate is real, and complications could range from minor deficits to catastrophic outcomes that would require institutional care indefinitely." Catherine closed her eyes, breathing slowly, processing information that would determine not just how long she lived, but who she would be during whatever time remained. William watched her, seeing the calculations happening behind her composed expression, knowing she was weighing impossible variables. More time as someone potentially unrecognizable, or less time as herself. "There's another factor," Dr. Chen added quietly, "the constitutional implications. If you choose the aggressive surgery and experience significant complications, questions arise about your ability to fulfill your role as Princess of Wales and eventually as Queen Consort. The palace needs to be prepared for scenarios where you might require a regent or replacement for public duties." William's anger, held carefully in check until now, finally broke through. "She's lying in a hospital bed being told she might die, and you're worried about constitutional protocols?" "William," Catherine said softly, stopping him, "they're right. We have to think about this practically. I'm not just a patient. I'm the future Queen Consort. My decisions affect more than just us." But that practicality, that willingness to consider the monarchy's needs even in the face of personal catastrophe, made William want to scream. He wanted to tell them all to leave, to take their statistics and options and constitutional concerns and disappear, leaving him alone with his wife to pretend, even for a moment, that they were just a normal couple facing a terrible diagnosis, not representatives of an institution that demanded sacrifice even now. "I need time," Catherine said finally. "I need to think, to talk with William, to consider what's right, not just for me, but for my children, for the work I've started, for everything." She looked at the medical team. "How long can we wait before deciding?" 24 hours, Dr. Morrison replied. "After that, we risk the tumor progressing to a point where even conservative surgery becomes too dangerous. 24 hours to decide between two versions of dying. 24 hours to choose between who she was and how long she might be." As the medical team filed out, leaving them alone again, William pulled Catherine close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and strong despite everything happening inside her skull. "Whatever you choose," he whispered, "I'm with you. The children are with you. We'll face whatever comes together." But even as he said it, he knew that some things couldn't be faced together. Some battles had to be fought alone inside the intimate darkness of one's own body, and all he could do was stand beside her and watch as she made a choice no one should ever have to make. when hope feels like cruelty. The news leaked before the palace could control it, which somehow felt fitting given how completely the situation had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to manage. A healthcare worker, perhaps well-meaning, perhaps simply unable to contain information too explosive to hold, mentioned something to someone who told someone else until by Thursday evening, just 36 hours after Catherine's collapse, social media was exploding with rumors about the Princess of Wales being seriously ill. The palace's hand was forced, and at 9 o'clock that night, they released a statement so carefully worded that its very caution announced catastrophe more effectively than any direct language could have. Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, has been receiving treatment for a serious medical condition. Further updates will be provided as appropriate. The royal family requests privacy during this difficult time. Within minutes, the world stopped. Vigils began forming outside Kensington Palace and Windsor Castle, people gathering with candles and flowers and tears streaming down their faces for a woman many had never met but felt they knew intimately. American networks interrupted their primetime programming. British television abandoned scheduled content for panel discussions featuring medical experts, royal correspondents, and grief counselors, preparing a nation for the possibility of losing someone who had become, in her years of service, not just a princess, but a symbol of grace, resilience, and modern motherhood. Inside Windsor Castle's medical suite, Catherine sat surrounded by specialists, her family, and the impossible weight of a decision she'd finally made after a night of tearful conversation with William that had stretched until dawn. She'd chosen the aggressive surgery, the option that risked everything for the possibility of years rather than months, not because she wanted more time for herself, though she did, desperately, but because she wanted to see her children grow, wanted to be present for their milestones, wanted to fight with every tool available rather than accept a gentle decline that preserved her dignity but stole her future. "I'm going to fight," she told William as sunrise painted their room in shades of orange and pink. "I'm going to take the risk, endure the surgery, face whatever complications come, because the alternative is giving up, and I'm not ready to give up. Not when George still needs me to help him prepare for his future. Not when Charlotte is just finding her confidence. Not when Louis is still so young he won't remember me if I'm gone too soon." William had held her as she cried, as the fear she'd been holding back finally broke through the composure she'd maintained for the medical teams, for the staff, for everyone who needed her to be strong. And in that moment, stripped of titles and protocols and royal expectations, they were simply two people who loved each other, facing a future that suddenly felt fragile and finite in ways they'd never allowed themselves to imagine. The surgery was scheduled for Saturday morning, giving them exactly one day to prepare the children, to say things that needed saying, to create memories that might have to last longer than anyone wanted to consider. They brought George, Charlotte, and Louis to Windsor Friday afternoon, sitting them down in Catherine's hospital room for a conversation that William knew would shape their childhoods in ways he couldn't prevent or soften. George understood immediately, his face crumpling before Catherine finished explaining. Charlotte cried quietly, asking questions that had no good answers, her child's mind trying to make sense of something senseless. And Louis, 8 years old and still believing the world was fundamentally safe, simply climbed into his mother's lap and refused to move, as if physical closeness could prevent the catastrophe hovering just beyond their understanding. "Mummy has to have an operation," Catherine explained, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "The doctors are going to try to make me better, but it's a big operation, and afterwards I might be different for a while. I might need help with things I usually do myself. I might be in hospital for a long time. But you're coming home, right?" Louis asked, his voice small and frightened. "You're not leaving us?" Catherine looked at William, her eyes asking permission to lie, to offer the reassurance they both desperately wanted to give. But William, thinking of his own mother's death, thinking of the lies well-meaning adults had told him that made Diana's loss even more traumatic when it came, shook his head slightly. Their children deserved truth, however painful. "I'm going to try my very hardest to come home," Catherine said carefully. "The doctors are very good, and they're going to do everything they can. But sometimes, even when everyone tries their hardest, things don't work out the way we hope. So I need you to know how much I love you, how proud I am of each of you, how much joy you've brought to my life every single day." George, mature beyond his years, understood what she was really saying. "You might die," he said. Not a question, but a statement of the truth everyone was dancing around. Catherine pulled him close, pressing her face against his hair. "I might," she admitted. "I don't want to. I'm going to fight with everything I have. But I might, and I need you to know that if that happens, it's not your fault, it's not anyone's fault. It's just something sad and terrible that sometimes happens in life." Princess Anne, who had remained in the doorway throughout this conversation, watching her great-niece and great-nephews grapple with adult concepts no child should have to understand, turned away, her hand pressed against her mouth. Even she, who had weathered decades of royal crisis with unflinching stoicism, found this particular heartbreak too raw to witness without emotion. That evening, after the children had been reluctantly taken back to Kensington Palace by trusted staff, after the medical team had run their final pre-surgery checks, after the palace had coordinated with security and communications teams preparing for every possible outcome, Catherine sat with William in the quiet darkness of her hospital room, both of them exhausted beyond sleep. "If something goes wrong tomorrow," Catherine said, breaking a silence that had stretched nearly an hour, "if I don't wake up the same person, if the surgery leaves me unable to be who I was, I need you to promise me something." "Don't," William said. "Don't talk like that." "I have to," Catherine insisted. "William, listen to me. If I survive but can't function, can't be a mother to our children in any meaningful way, can't fulfill my duties, I don't want to be kept alive simply because we have the medical resources to do so. I don't want the children's last memories of me to be of someone who looks like their mother but can't recognize them, can't speak to them, can't be present in any real way." William felt something inside him rebel against even hearing these words, against accepting the possibility they represented. "You're going to be fine," he said, though the conviction in his voice felt hollow. "The surgery will work. You'll recover. We'll have years together." "Maybe," Catherine agreed. "I hope so. God, I hope so. But if that's not what happens, if the worst occurs, I need to know you'll be okay, that you'll help the children through it, that you won't let grief consume you the way it consumed your father after Diana died." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Promise me you'll keep living. Keep being present for George and Charlotte and Louis. Keep doing the work we started together. Promise me my death, if it comes, won't destroy everything we built." William couldn't speak, couldn't force words past the grief lodged in his throat like a physical obstruction. So he simply held her, feeling her heartbeat, her warmth, the undeniable presence of her in this moment, refusing to imagine a future where these sensations existed only in memory. Outside, night had fully fallen, and across Britain and beyond, people who had followed Catherine's journey from university student to princess to future queen kept their own vigils, lighting candles, saying prayers, holding hope for a woman whose grace had touched them despite the distance. And inside Windsor Castle's medical suite, as Catherine finally drifted into medicated sleep before the surgery that would determine her fate, William sat in the darkness and wondered how hope could feel simultaneously necessary and cruel, how love could be both the greatest gift and the deepest wound, and how a person was supposed to face tomorrow when tomorrow might contain an ending too terrible to survive. The surgery is scheduled for dawn. The medical team is assembled. The nation holds its breath. And in the quiet darkness before everything changes, William sits beside his wife and tries to believe that love alone might be enough to carry them through what comes next. From which country are you watching this story unfold? Your perspective matters, because grief and hope transcend borders. And in this moment, The world waits together to learn whether a princess will live to see her children grow. Thank you for bearing witness to this heartbreak with me, and for understanding that some stories cannot have easy endings.